Welcome back, dear listener. Or if this is your first time by the fire, welcome for the first time. You found your way to the quiet hour of the nighttime historian, a place where the winds of time still whisper and the stories of old unfold slowly. One breath, one flicker, one memory at a time. Tonight, we turn not to the misty hills of the north, but to the sun-soaked dust of the Indian subcontinent, to a land carved by rivers and ruled by stories. This is no quiet kingdom of stone and fog. This is a land of flame, of thunder, of divine mothers and dancing gods, of sages beneath banyan trees, and queens who rode like lightning, before the company came with ledgers and cannon, before treaties were broken and palaces burned. There was a child, a girl, born not into power, but into poetry, not into privilege, but into purpose. She would rise to defy an empire, not only with sword and fire, but with conviction, with loyalty, with legend. This is the story of Rani Lakshmibai, the warrior queen of Jhansi, a widow, a mother, a soldier, a sovereign, whose name still stirs the hearts of those who whisper it. So now, let the world grow quiet. Let the day drift away like incense in a temple corridor. Let the hum of the fan or the cool night breeze carry you gently back, across centuries, to a land as ancient as time itself. And if you find rest in these journeys, I'd be honored if you'd leave a quiet note in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from, or which forgotten tale you'd like to hear next. Now then, draw closer, dear listener, and let us begin with the land before the flame. Before English queens and empires, before the red coats came with muskets and laws, there was only the land, a land ancient beyond memory, where stories were not written but sung, carried on the wind, through forests, across rivers, whispered by firelight etched into stone. This was Bharatvarsha, the sacred soil. In the northern plains the Ganges flowed like liquid divinity, cradling cities where scholars once debated the meaning of the soul, while pilgrims bathed their sins beneath saffron skies. To the west, deserts shimmered in waves of gold and heat, hiding temples buried in sand, still echoing with hymns to forgotten gods. In the south, the monsoon rain would lash against the jungled coast, soaking carved granite shrines dedicated to Shiva, Vishnu, and the many-faced goddess. And in the forests, it was said that sages sat cross-legged beneath banyan trees, listening not to birds or winds, but to the unstruck sound, Anahata Nada, the eternal vibration that holds the universe together. This was not merely geography, it was a living mythology, a land not ruled by men, but by Dharma, the sacred order older than kings, deeper than law. In those ancient days, truth and illusion danced as one. The world was layered, not flat, but full of veils. Behind each tree might stand a deity. Each mountain might house a god in slumber. And the people, poets, traders, warriors, saints, all lived within this sacred rhythm, not as individuals, but as echoes of something timeless. And so it was, for century upon century, until the tides of history began to shift. But before we speak of empires, before we draw swords or crown queens, let us stay here a little longer, in the hush of that dawn world, where God still walked barefoot, and every grain of dust carried the weight of legend. But even in lands cradled by gods, men began to build. Stone by stone, word by word, the first kingdoms rose, not to rival the heavens, but to reflect them. Cities blossomed along riverbanks and ancient trade roads, crowned with carved towers and quiet temples, wrapped in gardens and granaries, echoing with language, law, and the steady breath of order. In the eastern heartland, the Mauryan Empire stretched like a lion across the land, its might forged in conquest, its legacy reborn in wisdom. Ashoka, once a ruler of blood and battle, turned inward after the war of Kalinga, trading his sword for dharma and sending forth emissaries not with armies, but with messages carved in stone. His words, softened by time, weathered by centuries, still whisper from pillars half buried in fields where no empire stands. Then came the Guptas, and with them a flowering, not of war, but of thought. Mathematicians peered into the infinite and gave the world the gift of zero. Astronomers charted the stars in curved paths centuries before telescopes. Poets and philosophers spun truths in delicate Sanskrit, while sculptors gave form to gods mid-dance, caught forever in stone. It was a golden age, warm with insight, alive with rhythm, and yet, like all things golden, it faded. Always, the cycle returned. Empires rose like the monsoon and fell like leaves, undone by greed, by rebellion, by the silent patience of time. Yet through it all, something endured, something deeper than walls or names. Beneath every fallen throne lay the memory of a wiser rhythm, the belief that even kings must bow to something greater, to Dharma, to the turning of the wheel, to the order that binds sky and soil. And so the land remembered, not through monuments, but through myth. Beneath each ruin lay an older ruin. Beneath every palace, a story. And in the hush between one empire and the next, the land would breathe again. Then, from beyond the mountains and deserts, came new winds, not of the monsoon, but of steel and scripture. The age of the sultanates began, horsemen from Central Asia sweeping down through mountain passes and across river plains, bringing with them new tongues, new creeds, and the architecture of dominion. The Delhi Sultanate rose and fell like a storm, dynasties carving fleeting capitals from the dust, their minarets reaching skyward like prayers cast in stone. And yet, beneath conquest, culture bloomed. The call to prayer mingled with temple bells. Persian poets composed couplets in the shadow of Sanskrit chants. Something new took root, not replacement, but blending. And from that soil in time would rise the greatest of them all, the Mughal Empire. Under Babur and later Akbar, the empire stretched its marble wings across nearly all of Hindustan. Fortresses of red sandstone, gardens designed like paradise itself, courts filled with scholars, painters, astronomers, and spies. It was said that Akbar held midnight debates in halls without walls, where Sufis, Brahmins, Jains, and Jesuits spoke of God as the stars wheeled slowly overhead. Here was an empire that sought not only to rule, but to understand. Art flourished, music soared. The scent of rosewater and sandal drifted through palace corridors. But even this greatness, this fragile balancing of blade and blossom, could not endure. Aurangzeb's long reign would strain the fabric of tolerance, and beneath the weight of ambition, the empire would begin to crack. Rebellions sparked in the Deccan, power grew distant, and somewhere, in the quiet corners of this land, in forests, in forts, in the minds of mountain-born kings, resistance stirred. For even as one empire flowered, another was already waiting, just beyond the smoke and thunder. and from the western Ghats came thunder, not of rain, but of hooves, not of empire, but of defiance. In the hills and valleys of Maharashtra, where the mountains breathe mist and the fortresses cling to cliffs like memories, a new force stirred, fierce, native, and proud. The Marathas. Born from rugged land and rigid will, they rose not as an empire of opulence, but as a confederacy of flame. At their heart was Shivaji, the mountain-born warrior king, who dared to challenge Mughal supremacy with sharp steel and sharper mind. He struck like a shadow, vast, sudden, righteous, building not just forts, but legends. His was a kingdom of movement, of oaths sworn under the moon, of cavalry that vanished like mist after the strike. But beyond his military genius, Shivaji revived something older, the soul of resistance, the language of pride, the memory of a Hindu kingship unbowed. After him, the Maratha confederacy spread like wildfire, not always united, not always just, but always dangerous to those who thought the land was theirs to tame. They ruled not from marble courts, but from saddle and scroll, ministers who knew both statecraft and scripture, warriors who prayed before battle and sang in its aftermath. By the 18th century, they had broken Mughal power. Delhi burned beneath their watch, and kings now feared their charge. But even the thunder tires, internal rifts, regional rivalries, and endless warfare wore them thin. Still, the Maratha spirit endured, a memory of independence, a taste of freedom, and it was into this fading fire, this world of proud warriors and political cracks, that a new shadow began to fall. A different kind of conqueror, not born of mountains or temples, but of ledgers, uniforms, and ships from across the sea. And then they came, not with the thunder of warlords or the splendor of emperors, but with contracts, with cargo, with calm, deliberate footsteps on foreign soil. The British East India Company, a trading body at first glance, yet under its silken gloves lay the hand of conquest. They arrived on the coasts with ships and spices, and stayed with treaties and troops. A company that bowed before kings when it suited them, and dethroned them when it didn't. While the Marathas and Mughals wrestled over crowns and corridors, the company built fortresses of paperwork, alliances laced with poison, debts turned into chains. They studied a land not to revere it, but to measure it, plot by plot, coin by coin. Ancient temples and palaces were left to crack and crumble, while new railways and telegraphs crept across the land like veins of iron. And with them came a colder wind, one that spoke of civilization, yet carried silence. The silence of looted treasuries, of censored voices, of thrones declared illegitimate by foreign law. The doctrine of lapse, a rule invented in London, declared that if a king had no biological son, his kingdom would simply vanish into British hands. One by one, the native states fell, not to battle, but to bureaucracy, and the people, once subjects of kings, once part of empires shaped by dharma and divine will, now became subjects of the crown, governed from a world away. But even as the sun of native rule dimmed, even as the map of India was redrawn in red ink, somewhere in the heart of this ancient land, a spark remained, a spark that would grow into flame. And from that flame, she would rise. They called it Kashi, the luminous one, the city of light, a place so ancient so drenched in faith that even the guards were said to pause before entering. Temples lined the ghats like teeth of stone, their spires rising into the morning mist, gilded by sun and incense. Here, where the sacred Ganges curled like a ribbon of time, birth and death were not opposites, but two halves of the same breath. And it was here, among the ringing of bells, the chanting of priests, and the soft lap of water against burning steps, that a girl was born. They named her Manikarnika, after the cremation ghat, where the cycle of life was said to turn most pure. From her first cries, it seemed the air around her shimmered with something fierce and ancient, as though the city itself had breathed a bit of its soul into her. Her world was one of colour and contradiction. Saffron robes and crimson bangles, skulls on river altars, and jasmine in her mother's hair. She grew not in silence, but in symphony, lullabied by hymns and awakened by drums, surrounded by sages, merchants, astrologers, soldiers, and poets. The very stones beneath her feet held memory of fire, of river, of prayer. And though she was still only a child, the people who glimpsed her on the ghats would sometimes pause, just a moment longer than needed, as though sensing that this was no ordinary daughter of Kashi, but a spark waiting for wind. She was born into the Tambe family, proud Brahmins of the Marathi-speaking Kayastha caste, known not only for their learning, but for their steel. Her father, Moropant Tambe, was a scholar and court functionary, a man of letters and duty, yet not bound by the usual limits of his station. And so, unlike most daughters of the time, Manikarnika was not raised behind veils and walls, but in the open courtyards of discourse and discipline. While other girls learned to weave and serve, she learned to ride. While songs of marriage were whispered to others, she heard the clash of wooden swords. Her lessons included the sacred scriptures, the Vedas and the Ramayana, but also the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna spoke of duty and battle beneath the looming war of Kurukshetra. She learned to argue like a philosopher, to read like a priest, and to fight like a soldier. Her instructors in fencing, archery, and horse riding trained her alongside boys, and among them was one who would become both friend and flame in the future storm. Nana Sahib, the adopted heir of the Peshwa, raised under the same Bithor roof where Manikarnika's path would take root. They sparred in gardens and debated under oil lamps, their childhoods filled not with innocence, but with preparation. She was a daughter of Dharma, but also of Dand, of righteous strength, and in her eyes, dark, unblinking, steady, one could already glimpse the queen she would one day become, not in title, but in spirit, in the quiet way she stood taller than her age, or the fierceness with which she protected those beneath her. To the world, she was still a girl, but the fire had already been lit. There was something in her name, something that echoed far beyond the narrow alleys and lotus-strewn courtyards of her youth. Manikarnika, not just a name, but a place, a ghat where the dead are laid upon pyres and returned to the eternal flame, where souls, it is believed, find final release, liberation from the cycle of birth and death. To be named for such a place was no accident. It was said that Parvati, consort of Shiva, once dropped a jeweled earring there, a Manikarnika, and the gods themselves had blessed the ground in its memory. The legends clung to her, whispered by midwives and elders, as though the divine had already chosen her for something more. Some said the river had quieted at her birth. Others claimed a cow paused mid-step and turned toward the sunrise. But whether these omens were truth or tale, none could deny the feeling that she walked with fire in her breath. Even as a child, she was not easily bent. There were stories of her standing still in a thunderstorm, face tilted to the sky, or challenging a mounted soldier twice her size in play and refusing to yield. She was not unruly, but unruled. And though the customs of the time tried to shape her into a wife, a servant, a quiet branch of the family tree, she grew sideways, upward, wild, like a flame climbing the dry bark of history, and so the name remained, not just as memory of a sacred place, but as prophecy. For one day the whole world would know her not as Manikarnika Tambe, but as something sharper, brighter, something that burned. The road to Jhansi wound through dry hills and stretches of marigold fields, golden under the weight of a slow-burning sun. It passed through market towns with saffron-coloured walls and into a city of dust and memory, perched upon a rocky plateau, crowned by a fortress that clung to the earth like a jagged tooth. The air here was different, heavier, older. It smelled of stone and iron, of turmeric and rosewater, of silence kept too long behind high walls. This was no bustling centre of empire. Jhansi was a kingdom shrinking inward, ruled by a man growing old. And into this quiet citadel came a girl of 16, fiery, sharp-eyed, and barely able to conceal the war in her heart. Manikarnika Tambe, now to be known as Lakshmibai, was chosen to marry the Maharaja Gangadhar Rao, the childless, aging ruler of Jhansi. He was a man of culture, learned and kind, a lover of art and poetry, but also a man weighed down by illness, by grief, and by the slow erosion of his power. His first wife had died. His enemies watched for weakness. And in his court, alliances were made in whispers, not wine. The marriage was not of passion, it was of politics, of inheritance, of continuity. But Lakshmibai, she was not a pawn. She entered her new home not timidly, but like a spark in dry grass. Still, the palace was a world apart from the sunlit courtyards of Bithor. Its corridors were shadowed, its murals faded, its rhythms slower, like the final movements of a raga played just before dusk. Courtiers studied her. Servants bowed low. The rustle of silk and the click of anklets echoed in long, empty halls. And yet she did not falter. Dressed in red and gold, her hands painted with henna, she sat beside her new husband on a throne that seemed both too large and too old. She listened, she learned, she watched. In the stillness of her new life, she found space to sharpen, to harden. The Maharaja, for all his reserve, saw in her something rare. He gave her horses, allowed her to train in the courtyard. She read the accounts of the kingdom. She spoke to the guards. And when she walked the battlements of the fort, with the wind in her hair and the plains stretched out below, one might mistake her for a queen who had ruled there for years. But beneath this surface, there was a quiet tension. The British were watching. The kingdom was under debt. The palace echoed with the absence of an heir. And though the lamps were lit for her marriage, somewhere in the future, a fuse had already been lit. The palace of Jhansi stood tall against the dry wind, its ramparts proud, its walls scarred by age and memory. But within those walls, time moved differently. It passed not in hours or days, but in silences, long silences that stretched across empty courtyards and down corridors where oil lamps flickered even in the day. For all its regal grandeur, the palace was not a place of joy, it was a place of waiting. Lakshmibai now wore the silks of a queen, the weight of jewels heavy around her neck, but they could not mask the heaviness that pressed quietly at the corners of her new world. Gangadhar Rao, though gracious and learned, was often ill, withdrawn into his books, his paintings, his sorrow. He had known loss deeply. And now, despite his efforts to prepare a future, he found himself trapped in a present he could not control. The British watched his every move. The treasury strained. His own body betrayed him. And Lakshmibai, still barely more than a girl, found herself in a palace where affection was a murmur, not a song. There were whispers, of course. There always are. Whispers about her role, her bearing, her future. Some said she was too bold, too opinionated, too attached to her stallions and her swords. Others marveled at her composure, how she spoke with soldiers as easily as she did with scholars. She did not shrink from her duties. She studied court records. She observed the administrators. She walked the ramparts at dusk with her hands folded behind her back, watching not just the sunset, but the horizon. But shadows deepened. Their first child died in infancy, a grief too heavy for words, too sacred for ceremony. It was said that she stood in silence for hours by the cradle, unmoving. After that, the palace grew quieter still. And yet, from that grief, something steeled within her. She did not retreat. She did not crumble. She began to write letters on behalf of her husband. She attended council meetings. The servants began to refer to her not as the young queen, but as Jhansi Ki Rani, the Queen of Jhansi. Still, above them, always, loomed the shadow of the British East India Company, its laws, its agents, its unblinking eye. And then came the death of the Maharaja. No heir of blood, no line of succession, only a child adopted in hope, Damodar Rao, their chosen son. But the company did not see lineage, it saw opportunity, and in a letter sent from Calcutta, stamped and sealed, came the blade, the doctrine of lapse. Jhansi, they said, was no longer a kingdom. But Lakshmibai did not reply in despair. She replied in resolve. The mourning garments had barely settled on her shoulders when the letters came. Cold, clinical, written in perfect English ink, and soaked in quiet betrayal. The British East India Company, with its courts and codes, declared that Jhansi must be annexed. The adopted child, Damodar Rao, had no legal standing in their eyes. The throne was empty, they said. The line had ended. The crown would now pass, not to a prince, but to the company. The decision arrived not as a conversation, but as a pronouncement. And yet within the palace, wrapped in its silence, its stone and its sorrow, Lakshmibai did not weep. She read the letter once, then set it down. Then, without waiting for a summons or permission, she began to move. She met with advisers. She wrote petitions. She sent emissaries to Queen Victoria herself, appealing not with emotion, but with reason, with precedent, with dignity. And as she waited for replies that never came, she did not crumble. Instead, she governed. Jhansi, in those uncertain years, did not fall into chaos. It did not fade. It stabilized. The people watched her ride through the streets, cloaked in white, her face calm, her posture unshaken. They whispered of her strength, the queen who had lost a husband, a child, a crown, and still stood tall atop the fort's highest tower. watching over her city like a guardian carved of flame. The British assumed she would yield, that she would bow, fade, vanish politely into widowhood. But Lakshmibai, she was not made of silence. She had not been raised in shadows. She had studied the blade. She had studied the law. And now she studied the battlefield. "I shall not surrender my Jhansi," she said. And from that moment, the queen was no longer merely a royal widow. She became a symbol, a spark, a storm waiting to rise. It began not with cannon fire, but with murmurs, low and brittle, like dry leaves stirring in the wind. In barracks and bazaars, across tea stalls and temple steps, something shifted. Soldiers tightened their grip on rifles. Traders lingered longer in conversation. Priests paused mid-prayer, eyes narrowing at news half heard and half feared. India, vast, ancient and fractured, was beginning to stir. The year was 1857, and the air itself felt charged, as if the earth was holding its breath. In Meerut, a rumor had spread that the new rifle cartridges issued by the British were greased with the fat of cows and pigs, an insult to both Hindu and Muslim faiths. The sepoys, Indian soldiers in British uniform, hesitated, then refused, and then they revolted. It was a spark, but the field had long been dry. For decades discontent had grown in silence, kingdoms annexed under laws they never agreed to, temples taxed, princes humiliated. The old rhythms of life, the rights of inheritance, the customs of worship, the dignity of local rule, were being erased, replaced by coal policy and foreign decree. And now, as news traveled on foot, on horseback, in secret letters and coded songs, rebellion moved like a fever through the veins of the land. In Kanpur, Lucknow, Delhi, flames rose. Native troops turned on their officers. Civilians rose in riot. Forts fell. Flags changed. And the British, caught off guard by the speed and fury, scrambled to respond. This was no longer a mutiny. It was something older, deeper. The land was remembering itself. And in Jhansi, Rani Lakshmibai stood at the threshold of choice. She had not started the rebellion. She had not declared war. But as the winds of uprising swept ever closer to her gates, she listened, not just to news from the east, but to her people, to her soldiers, and to the quiet voice within her that had never truly been at peace since the British tried to claim her crown. She was no longer merely governing, she was waiting to see if history would knock at her door, or if she would be the one to throw it open. It began in the quiet hours before dawn, when the dust had not yet risen and the city still dreamed. But the fortress of Jhansi did not sleep. From its high battlements, soldiers kept watch, eyes scanning the horizon, fingers curled around spear and musket. Inside the palace, couriers came and went like shadows. Beneath their boots, the very stones seemed to tremble. The British were coming. The world beyond Jhansi had already ignited. Revolts in the north had turned into sieges, and sieges into slaughters. The company, now desperate to restore its grip, turned its full attention to the woman it once thought would submit. Sir Hugh Rose, seasoned and ruthless, was given one command: take Jhansi, break the queen. But Lakshmibai was already preparing. Within the city walls, men hammered nails into gates and poured boiling oil into iron cauldrons. Black powder was measured with steady hands. Children gathered water. Women rolled bandages and whispered prayers. The temples sang by morning and loaded rifles by night. There was no confusion now. There was no pretense of peace. The people knew what was at stake. Not just a throne, but dignity, memory, the soul of a kingdom. And in the heart of it all stood the Rani, clad in a soldier's coat, her sword belted at the waist, her eyes unflinching. She did not hide behind protocol. She rode through the city daily, her horse rearing at the gates, her voice clear as she addressed her people not as subjects, but as warriors. "We shall not surrender," she said. "Jhansi is ours." And they believed her. The siege began with cannon fire. Day after day, the British rained iron upon the fort. Walls cracked, towers crumbled, smoke hung in the sky like a second sun. And yet, Jhansi did not fall. Its defenders, farmers, nobles, ex-soldiers, even boys no older than 12, held the lines. They fought with grit, with memory, with something older than training, the raw will to defend home. In the night, the city glowed, not with peace, but with defiance. Fires were lit atop the walls. Watchmen rang gongs to signal movement. The people did not sleep. They murmured stories of the Rani's courage, how she had taken a British sabre in her bare hand, how she rode along the battlements at dusk, checking each post herself. Whether all of it was true no longer mattered. In war, belief is sharper than fact. But the British were relentless. Week after week, they ground their way forward, inch by inch, stone by shattered stone. Their guns heavier, their supplies endless, their orders cold. They breached the outer defenses. They poured into the city. The alleys turned red. The wells ran thick. Bodies fell on the steps of temples, and still the defenders fought. When it became clear the walls would not hold, Lakshmibai made her choice. In the smoke-filled corridors of the palace, she ordered her attendants to gather arms, horses, and what few trusted guards remained. She wrapped her son, Damodar Rao, now barely a toddler, against her back. And then, as the fires rose behind her, she mounted her horse and rode through the enemy lines. The night opened before her like a gate. British soldiers swore they saw a woman in white, her sword flashing, her child tied across her shoulders, cutting through the chaos like a vision from the epics. And just like that, she was gone. Jhansi had fallen, but the Rani had not. They would speak of it in hushed voices for generations, not as a battle but as a vision, a moment when history bled into myth, when smoke parted like a curtain and something divine rode through it. As Jhansi burned, its temples cracked open, its wells choked with ash, and its streets howled with cannon fire. She did not stay behind. Lakshmibai, now widow, queen, mother, general and symbol, refused to die within walls. She strapped her son to her back, his small body swaddled in cloth and bound to her with lengths of silk. Her horse, Badal, pawed at the blood-slick earth, restless, as if it too sensed the weight of what must come. The palace was already crumbling behind her. In its courtyard, statues had shattered. Oil lamps floated in pools of blood. Loyal guards held the gate just long enough. And then, in the hour just before dawn, when the sky turns that strange shade of grey-blue, and even death seems to pause, she rode, not through secrecy, not under disguise. She rode through the city's chaos like a blade through cloth. British accounts would later claim they saw a woman in a white turban and red sash, galloping through gunfire, sabre drawn, face streaked with soot. A child pressed against her back, and a line of cavalry thundering in her wake. They said the horse leapt a broken wall 15 feet high. They said no bullet could touch her. They said she vanished into the ravines like a storm pulled back into the clouds. Whether these things were true no longer mattered. What mattered was this: she survived, she escaped, and she did not stop. In the days that followed, she would ride hard across scorched land, from one rebel stronghold to another, never pausing for grief, never asking for rest. She would find allies in Tantiatope, and others still loyal to the rebellion. She would rally fresh forces, and she would continue the fight, not as a queen mourning her kingdom, but as a warrior commanding her war. Jhansi had fallen, but the legend of Lakshmibai had only just begun to rise. The road after Jhansi was not paved with triumph, it was paved with ash, burned fields, broken statues, the bones of ruined cities. This was the path the Rani rode now, not as a fugitive, but as a flame uncontained. Her name had become more than a story, it had become a rallying cry. Across Bundelkhand and the central provinces, rebels whispered her name with reverence. Lakshmibai is alive, she rides still, she fights on. And so she rode, leaner, sharper, hardened by the siege and the loss, but never broken. With her rode what remained of Jhansi's army, scattered cavalry, loyal retainers, new recruits drawn not by coin, but by conviction. Dust cloaked them, hunger stalked them, but their eyes burned with the same fire that lit hers. In Kalpi, she found old allies, among them the fierce and unpredictable Tantiatope. He too had become legend in the rebellion, waging guerrilla war with the company, vanishing into forests, striking like lightning. Their meeting was not ceremonial. There were no thrones, no drums, just two commanders, bonded by loss, bound by purpose, planning the next blow. Together, they marched. Their aim was Gwalior, a stronghold still rich in arms and troops, ruled by a hesitant prince. If they could take it, it would become the heart of the resistance, a place to regroup, to reignite the war. The plan was bold, desperate, but desperation had long since become the soil in which revolution bloomed. And so they came, Lakshmibai and her riders, storming the gates of Gwalior with thunder at their heels. The fort's own garrison, inspired or coerced, opened the city to them. For a brief moment, the dream flickered. The Maratha flag flew once more over Gwalior. The Rani stood again in a palace, and for the first time in months, the rebellion had a capital. But it would not last. The British were already moving, fast, and they were no longer taking prisoners. For a few fleeting days, it almost felt like victory. Gwalior, jewel of Madhya Bharat, stood not as a prize of the British crown, but as a defiant torch in rebel hands. The saffron flag of the Marathas fluttered once again from its towering citadel, catching the wind like a forgotten verse of freedom returned. Courtyards that had echoed with caution now sang with war songs. Men drilled in open fields, cannons were hauled up ramparts, and Lakshmibai, never still, rode tirelessly from post to post, inspecting fortifications, speaking with commanders, lifting morale. Her presence was not ceremonial, it was commanding. Even those who had doubted her before, courtiers, soldiers, nobles, now watched her in quiet awe. Yet behind every moment of hope marched inevitability. The British response was swift and absolute. They moved like a clenched fist, tightening from all sides, experienced generals, fresh supplies, heavy artillery, and cold orders. End it. No treaties, no negotiations, no mercy. From the south came General Smith, from the north Hugh Rose himself, the same man who had shattered Jhansi's gates. Now he returned with greater force, driven not just by duty, but by the need to silence a symbol. And so, once again, the Rani prepared for siege. But this time, there was no illusion of safety. The defenders were brave, but few. The walls were high, but crumbling. Supplies were limited, and many of the Gwalior nobles, once proud, now frightened, quietly sought British favour, their loyalty bending like reeds in storm. Still, she did not retreat. She summoned blacksmiths. She ordered armour refitted, horses shoed, arrows fletched. The palace was turned into a war room, and each evening as the sky dimmed and fires were lit across the battlements, she would walk the perimeter, sometimes alone, her shadow long against the sandstone, whispering prayers not for her life, but for her people. Those last days were heavy with portent. The air smelled of gunpowder and ghee lamps. The temples were filled not with song, but silence. Mothers tied protective threads around their sons' wrists. Young girls brought water to the soldiers with quiet pride. Even the children stopped playing. Everyone knew this would not be like Jhansi. There would be no escape. And then the siege began. The British cannons fired at dawn and did not stop. The earth itself shook. Walls that had stood for centuries splintered under the rain of iron. Still, Lakshmibai did not hide. She fought in the open, in full armour, astride her steed. She became part of the very landscape of defiance, a figure glimpsed through smoke and flame, sword in hand, issuing orders between clashes, lifting the wounded with her own arms. She led charges through enemy lines. She personally rescued injured men from under fire. She rode with her cavalry like a storm. British officers would later write of her with astonishment, not as an anomaly, but as a commander. She was the bravest and best of the rebels, one of them would later admit, not in flattery, but in reluctant truth. But even the bravest can bleed. By the fourth day, the city was cracking. The enemy had breached the gates. Buildings fell. Streets ran red. The defenders were dying one by one, not for conquest, but for memory, for dignity, for her. On the eve of the final day, Lakshmibai called her inner circle together. Her face was calm, not with peace, but with clarity. She knew the end had come. There would be no surrender, no parley, only legacy. And so she dressed once more in armour, not as a queen, but as a warrior. Morning came slowly, as though even the sun was reluctant to rise upon what it knew would unfold. A pale light filtered through the smoke over Gwalior, revealing streets scattered with debris, prayer flags torn and fluttering like feathers of fallen birds. The city was nearly lost, the walls breached, the palace overtaken. But still, from the ashes, she rode. Rani of Jhansi, now a sovereign without a state, a mother with no safe haven, and a commander with dwindling men, mounted her final horse. Her armour, dented and blackened with soot, glinted faintly in the dawn. Her hair, once tied in the neat braids of a royal bride, now flew loose behind her, a banner of defiance. She wore no crown, only steel. The British had entered Kota Ki Serai, a narrow pass on the outskirts of Gwalior. It was there she chose to meet them, not with negotiation, but with the sharp edge of resistance. With her small cavalry force, she charged, not from behind, but from the front. Witnesses would say she fought like the goddess Durga herself, whirling, unrelenting, divine in fury. She struck down soldiers twice her size. Her horse leapt over broken carts and cannon remains. Her voice could be heard above the roar, calm, steady, commanding. And then, a shot. They say it struck her in the side, just beneath the ribs. She did not cry out. She did not fall. She fought on, for minutes longer, blade soaked, face set in stone. But the wound was deep. Her strength waned. Her horse, loyal to the end, carried her from the heart of battle to the cover of a nearby neem grove, where she dismounted slowly and lay down upon the earth. She was not alone. 2 of her attendants, women, warriors in their own right, remained with her. They would not let her be captured. They would not let her body be paraded as a trophy. With quiet hands, they prepared a small pyre, and before the British could reach her, Lakshmibai, queen, general, widow, mother, legend, was returned to flame. The British arrived moments later and found only smoke. She had left them nothing. No corpse for display, no body to chain, only ash and a story. One officer wrote in his report, "She was the bravest and best of the rebel leaders, a man among mutineers." But he was wrong. She had never needed to be a man to be mighty. She had always been enough, as herself. And as the smoke rose into the pale sky above Gwalior, something larger than war or empire or history itself took shape. A memory too sharp to die. It was not silence that followed her death. It was song. In the days after her fall, there was no formal mourning, no state funeral, no elegy written by court poets. The British tried to erase her name, to reduce her to a footnote of rebellion. But the people remembered. They sang. It began in the villages, in the spaces the company could not touch, around cooking fires, in temple courtyards, in the hearts of women who washed laundry by the river and whispered her name like prayer. The stories were not written in ink, but in rhythm, passed from tongue to tongue in verse and memory. But even the poetry could not contain her. She was not a woman pretending to be a man. She was something older. In the hills of Bundelkhand, it was said that she had not died at all, that the fire had not consumed her body, but transformed it, that the goddess Durga, the 10-armed slayer of demons, had merely borrowed her form for a time, and now had returned to her celestial throne. Some claimed to see her in dreams, dressed in red, astride a lion, her eyes glowing with divine fire. Others swore the neem tree, where her pyre had stood, now bloomed out of season, white petals the size of her footsteps falling gently onto the earth. Women began naming their daughters after her, Lakshmi, Jhansi, Rani, names whispered into cradles like blessings and battle cries both. And in secret, even as the empire tightened its grip, girls learned to ride, to shoot, to speak without fear. Because somewhere, in some unseen place, it was said she still watched. When the rains came in Gwalior, the year after her death, sudden, fierce, unseasonal, the farmers said it was her spirit, washing the blood from the soil, refusing to let her people forget. And when the fires of rebellion reignited decades later, her name was not invoked with sorrow, but with promise. She had become more than mortal, more than queen. She had become prophecy. They say some souls do not fade, they return, not once, but again and again wherever courage is needed, wherever injustice dares to rise unchecked. And so it was with Lakshmibai. In the years that followed her death, she did not remain confined to books or statues. She reappeared in stories told to restless children, in the whispered prayers of widows left behind by war, in the dreams of soldiers far from home. In some villages, old women spoke of a rider in white who galloped through their fields on nights of thunder, her presence ushering in storms or chasing away raiders. In temples, when lamps flickered without wind or bells chimed without touch, devotees would bow their heads, certain the Rani had passed through unseen. And there were those quiet, serious men who claimed to have met her in the wild, a cloaked figure offering guidance at a crossroads, then vanishing between trees. Each tale was different, but the feeling was the same, that she had never truly left. Some believed she was reborn each century, not as a queen, but as a quiet woman in plain clothes, waiting, watching, preparing to rise again. In times of revolution, protest, and sacrifice, her name always returned, not simply as a memory, but as an invocation. Even among those who doubted the stories, few would deny the way her story made the spine straighten, the eyes sharpen, the breath deepen, because she was no longer just a historical figure. She was a guardian archetype, the warrior mother, the fierce protector, the flame in the dark. And in the hearts of millions, when the world grew cold or cruel or heavy, she stirred. There are flames that burn once, bright, fierce, and gone, and then there are flames that never truly go out. They settle into the earth, into the breath of a people, into memory. Lakshmibai is such a flame. You can feel it if you know where to look, in the early morning light on the ramparts of Jhansi fort, where her footsteps once echoed against stone, in the hush of the battlefield at Kotaki Sarai, where the neem trees now sway gently over forgotten bones, in the quiet corners of classrooms, where young girls whisper her name not as royalty, but as warning and promise. In the statues cast in bronze and ash, she stands eternally astride her steed, sword drawn, child bound to her back like a vow that cannot be broken. But even these cannot contain her. She exists in the spaces between history and faith, where only legends live, where time bends and truth becomes something deeper than fact. Some say she sits among the goddesses now, a warrior queen beside Durga and Kali, her blade forever drawn. Others say she became a guardian spirit of the land itself, riding still, unseen, wherever courage is needed. And if one day you find yourself walking beneath moonlight in the hills of Bundelkhand, and the wind shifts, and the trees begin to rustle without breeze, and you hear the distant sound of hooves, too fast, too fierce to be real, pause. You may be standing in a place she once passed through, or one she is passing through still, because though her kingdom fell, though her body turned to ash, the fire that was Lakshmibai still burns, in every voice that rises, in every injustice resisted, in every woman who refuses to bow. She was not born to rule, she was not born to fight, she was born to endure. And through us, she still does. And so, the story of Lakshmibai comes to a close, a tale not only of fire and resistance, but of honor, of memory, and of a courage so deep it carried her beyond life into legend. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you, truly. Whether your thoughts are still wandering slowly through the dust-colored forts and flame-lit palaces of Bundelkhand, or whether sleep has already begun to gently pull you beneath its waves, know that you are not alone. Tonight, we rode beside a queen who would not bow. We stood within crumbling walls, listened to distant cannon fire, felt the wind shift in a dying city, and watched as one life became a symbol no empire could erase. If this journey brought you calm, or clarity, or just a quiet place to rest, you are always welcome to return. When the world feels too sharp, or the night too long, these stories, slow, soft and waiting, will still be here. Let your thoughts soften now, like incense rising through an old temple corridor. Let your breath ease, like the cool air drifting through a Gwalior grove before sunrise. And let history, for tonight, hold you gently, like silk robes in a quiet palace, like a flame kept low but never lost, steady, flickering, and kind. Until next time, sleep well and dream deep.